Good evening, and welcome to CITI Media Reporter. I'm Howard Homanoff. Thank you for joining us this evening. My guest is Lynn Oberlander, General Counsel for First Look Media. Lynn, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And by the way, I would note, a graduate not of Columbia Business School, but of Columbia Law School.
That's right.
So happy to have somewhat of an alum here with us today. Lynn, why don't I start sort of maybe most obviously, but and people may have read about it on their own, but what is First Look Media and what is its mission?
Well, First Look Media is a digital media company that was started about a year ago, a little over a year ago, to do aggressive journalism, or journalism in the public interest, journalism that is supposed to be also experimental, that we are looking at. It is, right now we are publishing two things. One is The Intercept, which is a website founded by Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, and Jeremy Scahill that is devoted to national security reporting. And we recently started a project called Reportedly, reported.ly, which is helmed by Andy Carvin, who used to be at NPR, and that is a social media news project where you will live in social media and you will get news from on Twitter, from curated news on Reddit, on Facebook, that a team of journalists around the world is collecting for you. And we are looking at other projects. We are nonprofit. First Look Media is nonprofit and is devoted to aggressive journalism in the public interest.
Well, you've been able to, and you've had a terrific career of, and I'm not just blowing smoke, of having been, at NBC, working with NBC News, at Forbes, at the New Yorker, at First Look now. How have you seen the world of journalism change as somebody who's had to work so closely with journalists for a long period of time? How have you seen journalism and journalists changing through the course of your work?
Well, that's an interesting question. In some ways, the journalism hasn't changed at all, right? There are still people who are really interested in exploring and investigating and performing long-form journalism in terms of doing both video, television journalism, and also, obviously, written. We have seen I've seen over the course of my career, the medium has changed a little bit. There is obviously more focus now on immersive journalism, on journalism that both takes the pictures and the sound and the video and puts it together. It's required slightly different technical skills, I think, on the part of the journalists. There is also a sense, although I have been fortunate in many respects that I haven't seen this, you've seen a lot more listicles. I mean, things that are trying to, how do you drive audience has been very, very important to the journalists and to the places they work on. And so that has been a slight change. But it hasn't been the most disruptive element, and to use that phrase disruptive, has been that nobody knows how to pay for the journalism anymore. And that has created a lot of uncertainty and job losses. But the journalism itself and the journalists, I think, are actually pretty similar. Does
that cost pressure in investigative journalism, aggressive investigative journalism to your term, is expensive, right? If it's not, it's not sitting at home in your pajamas and just, whipping up a blog. It is not that there's anything wrong with that, but does the cost pressure is the greatest pressure on kind of that editorial level? Not necessarily even the person out in the field, but that infrastructure around editing and being a sort of the oversight or supervision of that.
It is there's cost pressure throughout, and certainly the kind of big team journalism that you and I actually did grow up with is fewer and far between because it's incredibly expensive. It's very expensive to send people abroad with a team, with a security team, with a producer, with a camera person, with a fixer, and then to bring it back and have editors and fact checkers and folks looking at it. And so there are obviously news organizations that are engaged in it, and some people are doing great work, but I think there are fewer of them. And certainly in terms of foreign reporting, there's been a real shakeup and change there.
So how do you're with a new enterprise that obviously saw kind of an opportunity or opportunities here. How do you view, I don't want to put you in an awkward position, but what others are doing in journalism today and sort of the quality of the journalism that you see, given all the cost pressures Are you fearful, disappointed, nervous about sort of the state of journalism, given, the obvious business pressures?
Not really. Actually, I've seen great journalism. Frankly, I have been incredibly fortunate to work for the best journalist organizations, I think, in the world, or at least some of the best. And there has been a complete commitment to quality throughout the time I've been working, and that hasn't stopped. And I think that interestingly enough, even as the older generation has in fact been laid off and had difficulty finding jobs and have lost pensions and have sort of the idea of a professionalism of journalism has really taken a beating in some ways, there have been enormous numbers of young people coming into journalism who are doing great things and who are still interested in the work. So I think that journalism will continue. I think there's an incredible desire for people around the country and around the world to get news and figure out important information, and there are people who are going to provide that news to them. But it has definitely been a rocky 10, 12, 15 years, and I think it will continue to be a little bit rocky until we figure out how people can get paid for it.
Yeah, and you're in an environment today too where you hear that it's very difficult for a journalist. In part, we're going through now, we see this trial going on in Virginia with the former CIA officer, James Sterling, and the controversy around the New York Times reporter, James Ricin, et cetera. And some people say there's sort of this war. It's bad enough, the business pressures, but there's also a war on journalists that's sort of taking place from within the Obama administration, which might surprise some. On the other hand, some people think, oh, they're all in cahoots with media, but others may see them as at war with the media. Do you see it that way? Does it feel that way, being somebody who's had to protect, work with journalists, make sure that their stories could be told?
The Obama administration, surprisingly, and you mentioned this, has brought more Espionage Act cases against suspected leakers, government employees, but still more Espionage Act cases than any other administration combined. And that has, in fact, reflected a nervousness, perhaps, or a discomfort with the process of what national security reporting is. That people, national security reporters, traditionally rely on sources within the administration, within other parts of the government, to bring important information to the people. And when they write a story that is based on some sort of confidential source, this administration has gone after the people they think are leaking to the media. And so, yeah, it's been a very, very tricky time for the press that way. They've seen, with all of the leak investigations, the national security reporters I know have spoken of a real chilling effect, that their sources in government are much less likely to tell them about things that that the public should know about what's going on in terms of our government and our government actions, because the potential sources, are quite concerned that they will be prosecuted under the Espionage Act or under some other type of a statute for divulging confidential information.
And what's interesting is, and that journalists even see it, and it's hard to say journalists as everybody, people have different opinions and different sources, but that again, a sort of conventional wisdom under Cheney and the Judith Miller situation and all the sorts of, and the leaks regarding Valerie Plame, et cetera, sort of, it seemed, people might think it was a much worse or much scarier place for journalists under the Bush administration, but it's not like the light went on or something changed in a very different way. I mean, when you're talking about, under the Obama administration.
No, in fact, it has been worse, and I think that is surprising. It was surprising to a lot of folks, a lot of people in the media, and it has been, with these investigations, there has been a really sizable chill. There has also been, when President Obama first came into office, immediately he indicated that the government was going to be more open in terms of FOIA and other types of transparency issues, and that was a great proclamation, but it has not happened. The government has been quite reluctant to produce information in response to FOIA requests or other types of press requests. So it has not really been an administration that's been incredibly friendly to the press. Now, what I should say is that recently, and when I say by recently, in the last 18 months, there's been a noticeable shift. About 18 months ago, 2 years ago, it was discovered that the administration, in one of these in two leak investigations, had first secretly sought phone records of 20 Associated Press reporters and editors, personal phone records, also professional phone records, and had not told the AP about it. So the AP couldn't go to court to try to quash the subpoena because they didn't know about the subpoena. It was secret. And when they found out about it, there was really a tremendous uproar. Very soon thereafter, a couple weeks later, we also discovered that the administration had, in the context of trying to get emails, again in a leak investigation, they had put into a search warrant for the email files of James Rosen, who was a Fox reporter. They had said that he had been an aider and abettor of an Espionage Act violation, or probable Espionage Act violation, and that's why they needed the search warrant. And again, when that was discovered or unveiled by the press, the press frankly went crazy, and rightfully so, because the journalist, James Rosen, was only doing what journalists do, which is trying to reach out to various government officials to find out information. And if somebody gave him confidential information, that doesn't mean that he was an aider and abettor of the Espionage Act. So after that, there was really quite a bit of protest, and the President and Attorney General Holder set up a series of meetings, high-level meetings between attorneys, journalists, civil rights groups, and the administration to try to work through some of these issues, and to revise the Attorney General's guidelines on dealing with the media. And there have been a sort of series of revisions, the most recent of which came out 2 weeks ago, which have made it, it's not impossible, mind you, I don't want to suggest it's impossible for the government to get reporters' information or their search warrants, or emails or phone records, but have codified it in a way that at least makes it difficult. The Attorney General has to sign off on any requests for information from journalists. From much of the information, you're only supposed to get a subpoena or a search warrant after they have made sure that there is no other way of getting the information, that it's essential to whatever investigation is going on, that there has been a real evaluation, if it's national security, if it's an Espionage Act investigation, that this is something that the government is committed to seeing through. And they've also said that journalists won't go to jail for doing their job. So that if they are in fact dealing with sources, and the sources provide confidential information, according to the statements of Attorney General Holder, they won't go to jail. So maybe it's gotten a little bit better now. Just to wind up.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the reporter going to jail. Well, for in the popular culture, this has probably gotten a lot of attention lately, and here comes a spoiler alert, so if you're fans of the newsroom, you may want to turn away for a moment. But Will McAvoy, the star of the newsroom, doesn't reveal a source, and he ends up in jail for 52 days, if I remember the plot. And is that and it may be the only drama in history in which characters debated the finding of Brandenburg v. Ohio in the Supreme Court, but
I think you mean Brandsburg v. Hayes.
Brandsburg v. Hayes. I don't know where I came up with that one. Very good. That's good to have Lynn here. So is that a separate issue from what we're dealing with, or is this directly, trying, at least from a federal government perspective, trying to better manage those kinds of situations?
It's the same issue.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right, and it is trying to better manage those situations from a federal government perspective. Absolutely, because what happens, as I think you know, is that there is no under the Brandsburg Supreme Court opinion, there is no privilege for a reporter to go before a criminal grand jury and say, I am not going to tell you who my source is. The Supreme Court said that, and then many years ago, And so that if you are a reporter who feels strongly that you need to protect the confidentiality of your sources, what could happen is that you could be subpoenaed to testify, you could move to quash the subpoena, you could lose, you could appeal that, you could lose again, and finally you could get hauled before a grand jury or a criminal trial and told and asked to about your sources. And if you refuse to testify, the judge can slap you with a contempt order, and part of that contempt can be fines, but it can also be jail. And right now, there is no recognized constitutional right to prevent you from going to jail for that. So at least under the current AG guidelines, before you get there, there should be some conscious decision from the Attorney General that this is important enough that you're going to have a big battle with the journalist. It's still pretty lousy, and it still doesn't give any sense of security to either the journalists, ab initio, or the sources, because they don't know when they're talking to each other or sending materials what's going to be the outcome down the road. And certainly, whatever it is, it's expensive, it's stressful. These processes are not cost-free, even if you end
up going to jail.
Going to jail. So Jim Risen, as you know, at the Times, wrote a book which was the subject of the subsequent leak investigation. That's what Jeffrey Sterling is now on trial for. And the government's argument is that Sterling was Risen's source. Risen had said consistently that he was not going to testify about who his source was. He spent many, many years in court. He lost in court. And fortunately, however, the government has now, as part of this whole process, has now said that he's not going to testify and he's not going to go to jail. But this is, I think, 7 years of agony and procedures. So it's pretty miserable.
And, I also want to ask about it in the same situation, but the responsibility of, in addition to, we're talking about the reporters being in jeopardy, certainly the sources in certain circumstances are directly in jeopardy because they may have violated their either an oath that they've taken in a government office or signed confidentiality agreements with the government or an employer. What's the responsibility? I know you've given some thought to this, about what a news organization owes or what they should do when their sources get in trouble. Even if, let's say the government has made a decision, we're not going after the news organization, at least as aggressively or as, obviously maybe as we have, but the source, is the leaker or the discloser, is still out there and in jeopardy. What is does the news organization owe a responsibility, legally or ethically, to that source, and what should they do about it?
It's a great question. It's one that we've been thinking about quite a bit because the traditional model is that, and I believe in this, right? You can't, as a part of the reason that the press can publish information that they receive from other people is that they haven't themselves done something illegal to get that information. And if they were paying, for example, for confidential information, or national security information, or any other information, could be corporate, civil, it doesn't have to just be government information. If they were paying for it, you maybe could make an argument that that was something illegal in terms of getting that information, and that would put the press at risk for itself. So it has been the practice of all the major media not to pay for information of that type, not to pay for information and not to offer any kind of inducement for that information. But and that inducement might include saying, hey, we will indemnify you if you get sued by your employer or by the government. So we don't do that. But it does put those sources, both corporate and government sources, at incredible personal risk, personal financial risk. And so we have been thinking, is there a way to support these folks some way down the line? And what issues does that raise? Can you set up a legal defense fund for them? How would you organize that? What would be? Because frankly, these guys, and women, of course, put their lives on the line for something they believe in, and then even if they have not done anything wrong or illegal, they don't end up in jail, the legal process itself is such a expensive one under our system that they can be bankrupted and have been bankrupted. There are many examples of it. So we're thinking about what we can do.
And I assume, all that process is something that's going to chill a lot of people from coming forward, fearing not only the incarceration fear, but the cost and the dragging their lives through years of that process.
I have worked with over my career. I've worked with many reporters who've said to me, "Hey, I have a source. Somebody wants to come forward. They want to talk to me about what's going on at this company or with this person, and they're really afraid that if they do, that the company they work for is going to sue them under the confidentiality agreement they signed or what have you." And even if there is a public, it still could be an incredible public service to disclose this information. And even as you know, as a lawyer, there are provisions of contracts that you sign that are void for policy. Right. And sometimes, obviously, if something is really illegal and you disclose it, that should not be a violation of your contract. Just the fear of the litigation itself has been enough to absolutely shut people up. And so maybe they'll make an exit, noisy or otherwise, but they won't necessarily be a source.
It raises for me also the question of today, especially who's a reporter. That we're the New Yorker, those people are reporters, the Times, Forbes, et cetera, or the great institutions, and one that you're building now, within First Look Media. But what about so often news is broken by unaffiliated, whether freelancers or just again jokingly, but the person at home, with good sources on the phone, who breaks a story. What kinds of the rights or distinctions do you have to make between, or should you, between quote traditional reporter and blogger almost becomes pejorative, but the point is someone who breaks news but not affiliated with an institution.
It's a great question, Howard. We have been struggling with it. So in some ways, back to this question of sources and confidentiality, many of the states have shield laws, a reporter's privilege shield law. New York, for example, has a fantastic one, and if you have a confidential source in New York, you cannot essentially be hailed to court or hailed to a New York state court and asked to divulge your source. There is an absolute privilege for confidential sources and a qualified privilege for non-confidential sources. Federally, we don't have a shield law. And over the last few years, there have been several occasions where there has been a great attempt to come up with a shield law, so to give some reporters some level of protection that they have in many, if not all, of the states. And one of the sticking points, there have been a number of sticking points, national security is one of them as well, but one of the sticking points has been how do you define who a journalist is? And it is tricky. So yes, the people I have worked for, they're all journalists under any definition. But if you're somebody sitting at home now, do you regularly break news? That would be usually one criteria. Do you get paid for your blogging? That's another criteria. Did you have the intent at the time that you gathered the information to distribute it publicly? That's actually a great definition. But that hasn't really made its way into the statute, but that would make sense. I mean, if you're sitting at a bar and somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, I just heard this," and you then go and blog it, you're not a journalist. I mean, unless you do this on a regular basis, which maybe you get your stories that way. But if you do regularly write something and intend, even though it's as a blogger or a netizen or however, freelance journalist, whatever you want to say, and you regularly write things and you regularly tell a larger audience about them, and somebody tells you this information, then maybe you should be able to avail yourself of the reporter's privilege. But the definitions have been very, very tricky because obviously if everybody can be or can call themselves a journalist, then the privilege in some ways is meaningless and nobody would ever agree to it.
Right.
So
I want to take advantage of having you here to talk about a couple of the big issues going on around the journalism, the news community now. And most obviously, you mentioned your association with Glenn Greenwald, is the the Edward Snowden story, which was probably the most, one of the most almost mesmerizing stories, maybe since the Pentagon Papers of the divulgence of classified government information. How do you see Snowden? And I realize you've got a working relationship with Greenwald, but how should the public, you think, sort of see what Snowden did and how to think about those issues, not only in Snowden's case, but kind of going forward?
Well, I think what is the and frankly, the disclosures that came out last year from Glenn Greenwald, I guess actually the year in 2013, from the Snowden papers that Greenwald and Quattrus wrote up for The Guardian and the Washington Post reporting that was done. I mean, they are actually the reason that I am at First Look Media. I mean, those are enormous stories of public importance. The fact that the U.S. government was taking every single person's, yours and mine, we can only assume, and everyone in this room and everyone's watching, that they were taking our phone records without a warrant and storing them indefinitely. So from the possibility that maybe at some point there might be somebody who was a terrorist that they were going to jump back, it's still outrageous to me. I mean, I'm still, really worked up about it. And so the disclosure of that program particularly, but of these other programs as well, that the Snowden disclosures made possible, I think is really, really reporting in the public interest. And I wouldn't want to do anything that would stop that kind of reporting. What Snowden did he did, in my mind, really he was the most responsible in that he didn't say, I have now stolen all of these documents and I am just going to put them up on the web and anybody can look at them. That is not, in my mind, responsible. He found journalists that he believed in and that he had worked with, and he said, I don't want to make these decisions. I want you to look through this, to work with experts, to confer with the government and report the stories that need to be reported. And that's what they have been, and we have been engaged in doing and working with other media. And of course, the Washington Post has been doing their own reporting on this, and other news organizations, Der Spiegel. And I think that was that separated what Snowden did from, say, WikiLeaks, which published, just published all these cables and put them up, or at least threatened to. The other hand, I think that the government has been incredibly lucky and has played this very well, in that the biggest story in my mind that has really been undercovered, and I'll put us in that realm as well, is that Edward Snowden was able, to begin with, to get all of these documents. How do we know? I mean, he was able. He's this guy. He's not particularly old. He's not He's not a senior official. He's out in Hawaii, and he is able to amass what he says are thousands of documents, now highly classified, top secret documents, without anybody knowing it. How do we know that somebody who wasn't a journalist or a believer in public information, how do we know that somebody who was working for one of the foreign governments didn't do the same thing 2 years earlier and take all of this information? The way that the government was securing its top secret information, to me, is both appalling and is the biggest story that still really needs to be reported. The fact that very few people, if anybody, have lost their job in Washington over this really appalling national security breach is really is still, to me, astounding. So it is a so I think it's really continues to, and there will be more reporting, obviously, coming out of the Snowden documents.
Lynn, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thank you for joining us on CITI Media Reporter. I'm Howard Homanoff. Good night.